As Chris said, we'll continue on the Lamentations series. As you've got up here, I think Lamentations 4 is where we're going to be here in a couple minutes. I think that'll be up on the screen for you. Of course, you can find it in your own Bible or on your own device if you'd like to do that. To be completely honest, Lamentations 4 is not a great chapter. Now, is that a downer? Is that a bad way to start a talk? I teach Bible at a Christian school, and I get to preach from time to time different places. And there are certain passages that are really, really cool to preach and teach on. Now, for some of you, even if you've done like kid church or something, I'll bet you've had that moment where you've looked through the kid church booklet and you're like, yeah, parting the Red Sea, that's awesome. Like, that's going to go over really well. Or Jesus calms a storm on the sea, and the boats come to safety and peace be still, and that's awesome. There's other chapters, like Lamentations 4, that are not quite so awesome. That don't really preach that well. Actually have a lot of terrible content in it and is frankly a lot like reading somebody's nightmare. And that's kind of where we're going today. So there you go, how's that for an intro? But we know that Paul says all scripture is inspired by God, is profitable and is useful, and that's where we're going to go with Lamentations 4. So hopefully it'll be good. But we're going to jump in here in just a minute. Let me take a minute to pray. I know they prayed already, but I like to pray as I start. Take a minute to pray, and then we'll jump into Lamentations 4 here for a couple minutes, and then hopefully get to the good news. All right? Let's pray. God, I thank you again just for everyone that's here today. I thank you for each friend, guest, visitor, partner, whomever you've brought here today to worship you, to sing to you, and to hear from your word for a couple of minutes. God, I pray that your word would be effective. As you have said, I pray it would be useful and helpful, even though this is a difficult passage. We know that you inspired all of it, the difficult parts and the parts that maybe we tend to like or gravitate to. And I pray that your spirit would do work even in a dark passage, but I pray that the good news of the gospel would shine more brightly in contrast to a passage like this. I need your help to do that. I pray that I would be clear. I pray to be effective, and I pray your spirit would work. In Jesus' name, amen. Okay, so we'll be in Lamentations 4 here in just a minute. Again, I think it'll be up here, and we'll read here. But Chris has taught for a couple weeks on Lamentations, and I don't want to take a ton of time to recap all that he said. If you want to kind of skim through your Bible or look or just kind of, think back on these past couple weeks, Lamentations, of course, the book is named for a lament, and that's a type of poem or a type of literary device that they used in ancient Israel, and honestly in other cultures as well. It's like a really, really sad poem that they would use. And we don't always do this today, but to me, I was trying to think of a modern example, and it's almost a little bit like maybe like a eulogy at a funeral, something like that. To where, in this case, most people, myself included, think Jeremiah wrote this, and Jeremiah is looking back at the fall of Jerusalem, and he's sort of composing these 5 different poems, which correspond to the 5 chapters in your English Bible, these 5 different poems of lament or sorrow about the book. Now, while all of those, to a certain extent, of course, are going to be sad, I think chapter 4 is the worst one. All right? Like last week, chapter 3, at least you have that like little great is thy faithfulness, little nugget there in the middle. Chapter 5, where we'll go next week, has a prayer to God with at least some confidence in it. But chapter 4, as I said before I prayed, chapter 4 to me, it almost sounds like I'm sitting down and I'm talking to Jeremiah, almost like a Dateline 2020 interview, and he's recounting the nightmare that it was when the city fell. And, we hear that, and sometimes I think we're like, yeah, that's really sad that the city fell, but I really want you to feel the weight like Jeremiah would have. Not only was this a city in Jeremiah's home, and that'd be bad enough, right? I mean, if your hometown was destroyed, that means your house is gone, your stuff is gone, probably a lot of your friends and neighbors are dead or captive. I mean, that's bad and traumatic. But beyond that, this isn't just his hometown. If I can put it this way, this is like God's hometown. Back in the ancient world, different deities and such had different temples, and this was viewed by not just the Jewish people, but by everybody as the place where God lived. And that got destroyed. The temple was utterly destroyed. Now, the pagans would say, look, we defeated you, we defeated your God, our God is better than your God, and that whole thing going back and forth. But for somebody like Jeremiah that had spent his life, and frankly, a relatively unsuccessful ministry, trying to get people to worship the true God, now, even his temple where God was to be worshiped is no longer there. It's destroyed. Take it a step farther. Not only has that happened, but the king, in the waning years of Judah's history, we swapped through a few different kings, but the king, the last king that got taken away in the line of David, is no longer on the throne. And again, you may be thinking, why is that a big deal and why does that matter? Well, all of these promises of God that had been given to the Jewish people had gone through this idea of this land and this city and this king, and Jeremiah is sitting back, it's all gone. I don't know, maybe imagine if you've seen like a post-apocalyptic movie, maybe minus some of the crazy modern technology, but that's sort of what Jeremiah is looking at. And it's where do we go from here? Right? What's next, Jeremiah? What do we do? Everybody's gone, utter destruction, devastation, death everywhere. And I think Jeremiah is going to take some time to process and talk. Now, I don't think that Jeremiah would have written any of Lamentations if he still didn't have faith and confidence in God. Because otherwise, what's the point, right? If Jeremiah, looking back on his life, which again was relatively unsuccessful from a human point of view, and what I mean by that is very few people listened to him. He was the last warning guy, right? He's the last guy waving his arms saying to Judah, stop, you've got to turn, you've got to change, you've got to stop. And they blew right by him and went over a cliff. If you are Jeremiah in that moment, if I'm Jeremiah, I'm going to be struggling probably with anger, right? Not just that I lost stuff, but how could these stupid people have done that? This didn't have to happen. We didn't have to get destroyed. We didn't have to get invaded. God's temple could still be there, except that these stupid people wouldn't listen. Now, Jeremiah didn't exactly write that, but if I'm Jeremiah, I'm feeling that. Maybe another way I might respond would be with guilt. Man, maybe I didn't preach enough. If I had preached one more sermon, if I had gotten into the king's throne room one more time, and if I had said this, or maybe I didn't do this right, or maybe I didn't do enough to keep these people from going over the precipice. But again, that's not really the vibe we get from Jeremiah either. Jeremiah here is going to look at suffering, the suffering that he's experienced, the suffering that people have experienced. He's going to look at that, and I think, to use the title that we're using for this sermon series, I think he's going to learn to embrace suffering. And that's how we're going to sort of title this talk, is Embracing Suffering. Now, those words don't even seem to go together, right? That almost sounds like, me telling you, embrace a porcupine, or embrace hot coals, or, it doesn't seem to go together, right? We don't want to suffer. Suffering hurts. Suffering's bad. We don't want to embrace that. Now, there's probably a few like crazy CrossFit people here that are like, no, we embrace suffering. And it's like, all right, if that's you and you're into CrossFit, awesome. I get the whole pain is weakness leaving. Okay. Yeah, anyway, for most of us, though, not to pick on you guys, but for most of us, though, suffering is not something we would embrace. It's not something we would choose. But I think Jeremiah is starting to process, and he's getting there. But I think the reason that he is able to get there, not that I think he liked the suffering, and as we read this text in a minute, he didn't like it. But I think the reason he's able to get to the point of embracing it is he has faith that God is not done with his people. Or if I could go back and cherry pick a little bit of happiness from another chapter, because we don't have much here. Chapter 3, great is God's faithfulness. Or if I could go back to the book of Jeremiah itself, there's a new covenant coming. All these people that Jeremiah preached to, they couldn't handle the old one. They messed it up. They blew it over and over and over and over and over again. But God spoke through Jeremiah and said, I'm not going to be done with these people. I'm going to give a new and better covenant. And I'm going to send a new and better guy to open this up and to lead the people in it. And the good news about the new covenant is it's not going to be written on tablets of stone. I'm going to have my spirit write it in people's hearts. Now, we're going to get to that more here at the end. My point is, I think even as Jeremiah processes something this bad, I think the only reason he's even able to cope with this and write it down so that you and I can see it today is Jeremiah still had hope. So my talk today, while we're titling it Embracing Suffering, my main idea today is this, and then I want to actually read Lamentations 4 and try to make a few observations. Here's my main idea today. We can only learn to embrace suffering, as funny as that sounds, we can only learn to embrace suffering when we view it through the lens of the gospel. We can only learn to embrace suffering when we view it through the lens of the gospel. Or, to put it another way, we're going to look at the bad news now and we're going to get to the good news at the end. Okay? That's what gospel means, and we'll get there. All right, what I want to do next is I want to read chapter 4. Now, forced me to hyperventilate. He said he's just going to read a whole chapter. I am actually going to read a whole chapter. And I realize in public speaking and in preaching classes, they tell you to never read more than 5 verses because nobody pays attention. And especially in the modern age, everybody starts looking at other stuff on their phone. And while that may happen, I'm going to take that risk, okay? It's 22 verses. And I realize I may not have the most awesome radio voice. I don't know what you think of my voice, but try to get through with me. And one of the reasons I want to read chapter 4 start to finish is it's designed to be one poem. Now, of course, it's originally a poem in Hebrew, so if I read it and you're like, this is a terrible poem, it's originally a poem in Hebrew, translated into English, but I sort of want you to get the effect of the whole thing, okay? So even those 22 verses, try to track with me. We're going to try to go through it, make 2 observations, get to gospel, and then wrap it up, all right? I'm going to read. from the New Living Translation. I'm not sure if it's ESV or what'll be up here, but either way you can follow along, or you can just sort of close your eyes and listen if that helps you visualize. But here's what Jeremiah says in his fourth lament here in his book. Chapter 4, verse 1. Jeremiah says, "How the gold has lost its luster. Even the finest gold has become dull. The sacred gemstones lie scattered in the streets. See how the precious children of Jerusalem, worth their weight in gold, are now treated like pots of clay made by a common potter. Even the jackals feed their young, but not my people Israel. They ignore their children's cries like ostriches in the desert. The parched tongues of their little ones stick to the roofs of their mouths in thirst. The children cry for bread, but no one has any to give them. The people who once ate the richest foods now beg in the streets for anything they can get. Those who once wore the finest clothes now search a garbage dump for food. The guilt of my people is greater than that of Sodom, where utter destruction struck in a moment and no hand offered help. Our princes once glowed with health, brighter than snow, whiter than milk. Their faces were ruddy as rubies, their appearance like fine jewels. But now their faces are blacker than soot. No one recognizes them in the streets. Their skin sticks to their bones. It is dry and as hard as wood. Those killed by the sword are better off than those who die of hunger. Starving, they waste away for lack of food from the fields. Tender-hearted women have cooked their own children. They have eaten them to survive the siege. But now the anger of the Lord is satisfied. His fierce anger has been poured out. He started a fire in Jerusalem that burned the city to its foundations. Not a king in all the earth, no one in all the world would have believed that an enemy could march through the gates of Jerusalem. Yet it happened because of the sins of her prophets and the sins of her priests who defiled the city by shedding innocent blood. They wandered blindly through the streets, so defiled by blood that no one dared touch them. Get away, the people shouted at them. You're defiled, don't touch us. So they fled to distant lands and wandered among foreign nations, but none would let them stay. For the Lord himself has scattered them, and he no longer helps them. People show no respect for the priests and no longer honor the leaders. We looked in vain for our allies to come and save us, but we were looking to nations that could not help us. We couldn't go into the streets without danger to our lives. Our end was near. Our days were numbered. We were doomed. Our enemies were swifter than eagles in flight. If we fled to the mountains, they found us. If we hid in the wilderness, they were waiting for us there. Our king, the Lord's anointed, the very life of our nation, was caught in their snares. We thought that his shadow would protect us against any nation on earth. Are you rejoicing in the land of Uz, O people of Edom? But you too must drink from the cup of the Lord's anger. You too will be stripped naked in your drunkenness. O beautiful Jerusalem, your punishment will end, but you will soon return from exile. But Edom, your punishment is just beginning. Soon your many sins will be exposed. And that's not a happy poem, if you didn't pick up on that. Again, I almost feel like this is Jeremiah's nightmare, or Jeremiah trying to process all these things that happened. Things from cannibalism to hunger to starvation to fire to destruction. And even at the end, where we almost have a little hint of hope, where he starts to say to Judah, you're going to come back from exile, we don't really have a nice flowery prayer to God. We have, oh yeah, Edom, you're next, right? Foreign nation next to them. You're next. You know, God's wrath is coming. And this is almost like a sort of a bitter, angry edge to this poem. Now, as I said before, this is not all that there is to Lamentations, okay? So this is sort of like if we're watching a movie, we only saw the scene where everything goes wrong. Does that kind of make sense? Or if you're watching a series of movies, like I told my son Peter, who's 10 and a big Star Wars fan, chapter 4 is like only watching the bad part of The Empire Strikes Back. Like we don't quite get to everything else. And if I lost you with the Star Wars reference, this is sort of just the bad part. But even then, we're anticipating something else. And again, I think that's where Jeremiah is going to go. Okay, so as he begins to embrace it, even though it doesn't say gospel here, I think we're going to get there. And again, my main point is we, like Jeremiah, we only learn to embrace suffering when we view it through the lens of the gospel. And in Jeremiah's case, this is going to be hope and new covenant. So 2 observations very quickly on what Jeremiah does in chapter 4. Then we're going to try to get to applying it to you guys. Okay, first sort of reason or first sort of step, maybe is a better way to put it, to Jeremiah beginning to embrace suffering is I think that he states and realizes and sort of owns that suffering is real and it hurts. And you may say, Dan, that's the Captain Obvious moment. Well, I get that, but I think he's going to start there, and I think that is significant. He comes to this place of saying suffering is real, and he graphically describes it here, right? I mean, little kids crying for bread and nobody's got it. People resorting to cannibalism and fire and judgment and suffering everywhere, blood on people. I mean, this is what Jeremiah is dealing with, and I think he's going to get to the point of saying, suffering is real and it hurts a lot. It hurts. Now, again, I think that's probably significant for Jeremiah because, you know, if he was like me or if you're like me, sometimes I'm prone to sort of skip that step. Now, again, some of this may be tailored to your personality, your upbringing and such, but I kind of tend to skip the get down and sit on the curb and cry with my kid that just scraped their knee. I tend to be the analytical one that's like, hey, Peter, Andrew, you should have looked at the curb. What are you doing? You know, tie your shoes better next time, and try to be a little bit more loving than that. But can you see how Jeremiah could have gone there? Instead of recounting the suffering, as awful as that feels and as awful as it is to read it, I think Jeremiah here is saying, this really was bad. Let's all sort of feel the badness together for a minute. Or as the cliche goes, misery loves company, right? Let's sit down here. Or as the New Testament would put it, weep with those who weep. And there's a time to do that. Jesus at Lazarus' funeral, interestingly enough, knowing he would raise Lazarus from the dead, took time to stop and weep with the mourners. Ever think about that? He could have just blown right by him. You know, hey, all of you crying, just, buck up, stand up, get out of the way. I'm going to heal this guy anyway. Here's the tissue. Come over here. You're not going to believe this. No. When Jesus goes in, he stops with these people, with Mary, with Martha, who come to him, and they're angry. You guys remember that story? Both sisters run up to him, and they're like, Jesus, if you would have been here, he wouldn't be dead. But anyway, Jesus stops and he weeps with them. I think there's a place to do that, and I think that's what Jeremiah is starting to do here. He's owning the fact that suffering is real and it hurts. Now, for some of you that are sitting here today, I don't know what all is going on in your life, but some of you are like, yeah, I'm there right now. I know it's real and it hurts. And I think maybe a thought for the rest of us is to feel some empathy there. And again, if you're like me, maybe not try so hard to fix it in 30 seconds or less, but take time, as Chris preached a couple weeks ago, to listen and identify with that yeah, I believe that you're suffering. Or if I'm suffering, allow other people to comfort me. And I think that's what Jeremiah is starting to do here. So I think Jeremiah owns the fact, first of all, that suffering is real and it hurts. Suffering is real and it hurts. I think then that he moves on then. The other thing that I think, other step that he takes here as we try to wrap it up here in a minute, I think the other step that he takes here is after he sort of owns it and feels with these people, he's going to start then and only then to try to help them see hope in God, or to put it another way, to see sort of the theological basis for what's happening. Now, again, I think it's important we do that second, right? I need to put a Band-Aid on my kid's knee before I tell him to look out for the curb, right? But I think that's what Jeremiah is going to do next. And in this particular passage, I think Jeremiah is concerned that Israel, or Judah in this case, realizes that God is just. Notice here how God is referred to, and we'll just cherry pick a couple verses off. Verse 6, for instance, in the midst of talking about all this, Jeremiah is going to go after God's justice, and Jeremiah says something really striking, especially if you know the Old Testament. In verse 6, Jeremiah says, the guilt of my people is greater than that of Sodom. Now, if you don't remember the story, I'll leave that for you this afternoon to go back to the book of Genesis 18 and 19 and read the story. There's actually two sort of sister cities there, Sodom and Gomorrah, that were incredibly vilely perverse and wicked. And again, I'll leave that for you to go back and look at. Those cities were so wicked that God didn't even take the time to have a siege happen. God literally rains down fire and brimstone from heaven on those cities because they're that wicked. And in fact, Abraham tried to get the city spared. You guys remember the little give and take he does with God? And Abraham, it almost feels like an episode of Shark Tank or something, like going back and forth making a deal. And Abraham gets God to the point where God says, if there are 10 righteous people in that city, I'll spare it. You know the end of the story. Apparently there weren't 10. So Jeremiah says to the people of Judah, your sin is worse than Sodom. Now, I don't know who you think is the most vile historical character ever, but this is sort of like Jeremiah looking at you and saying, your sin is worse than Adolf Hitler. And I think we need to feel that. I mean, that's like the worst guy ever, right? I mean, that's awful, that's terrible. And Jeremiah is saying God is just to judge sin, and that's how you and I need to view sin. A little bit later on, Jeremiah again talks about the guilt of that verse. For instance, verse 13. Verse 11 first. Verse 11 first, Jeremiah says, but now the anger of the Lord is satisfied. His fierce anger has been poured out. He started a fire in Jerusalem. Down to verse 13. It happened because of the sins of her prophets. And even here, right at the end of the chapter, when Jeremiah almost kind of gives a little glimmer of hope, where he says, beautiful Jerusalem, your punishment will end, he's going to tell other people that God is still just, that punishment comes. Now, if you're like, okay, Dan, that's really not that helpful when, we're suffering and to just sit back and think about punishment in the world, I think this gets us to gospel. So very quick, in the last couple minutes I have before we apply it, how does this get us to gospel? Well, suffering in the Bible is a really big idea, and there's no way in 2-3 minutes I'm going to explain it all. But biblically speaking, suffering enters the world because of sin. Maybe later today, you could take the time to go back to Genesis chapter 3 and look at the first sin, where Adam and Eve rebel against God and choose to eat the fruit, and the effects of sin enter the world. They enter their bodies, but God curses the world. You ever thought about how sort of unfair that is? If you're a happy dolphin or an oak tree or a nice flower, like Adam sinned and you got cursed. Death and decay enters everywhere. So big picture theologically, suffering is due to sin. Now, sometimes I think we connect this easier than others. If you were to go rob a bank today and get caught, stealing is sin, right? Are we good with that? Rob a bank and get caught, and you're sitting in jail and you're like, this is really miserable. You can probably quickly connect the dots between, I'm miserable because I sinned. Like we can connect the dots. There are other times, though, that I would say that suffering is a result of God cursing the universe. So that guy, for instance, that robs a bank or robs a store and goes to jail, he may be suffering in jail because of his sin, but let's say that guy gets the flu virus. Did he do one sin to get the flu virus? Well, we don't want to fall into that. We don't want to fall into the theology of Job's friends where they're like, hey, Job, what bad thing did you do, man? Sometimes evil is just in the world. But either way, the gospel is the answer. Whether it's something I intentionally chose to do that causes my suffering, or whether it's the curse that God puts in the world because of Adam's sin, either way, God deals with these in the cross, in the person of Jesus Christ, and we call that the gospel. The word gospel literally means good news. And if you're like me, after Lamentations 4, we need some good news. The good news is God deals with sin. And if you're like, well, that punishment sounded really bad, that's because God is just. But here's the way that Paul puts it over in Romans 3. Paul says, apart from the law, or apart from obeying God, whether you're these people in ancient Jerusalem or you're sitting here in Virginia Beach today, God is just and judges sin. But the good news of Romans 3 says, apart from the law, and I'm paraphrasing now, God made a way. God made a way so that we can be saved apart from the law through Jesus Christ. And Paul ends that little paragraph there in Romans 3:21-26, and he says, and that's how God is just and the justifier of the one that has faith in Jesus. So how do we bring this together with gospel, with the good news of Jesus' life, death, and resurrection? Well, for you and me personally, when we suffer, and again, I don't know what all of you may be going through today. Some of you today, if I were to ask you to think of your suffering or of your friend's suffering, some of that may be caused by making sinful choices. And I'm not here to give you a guilt trip. We're here to get to gospel. But if that's you, and if you're looking back and you're saying, I'm suffering because I sinned, because I shouldn't have done that, or because I should have done that, I think the gospel meets us there, or to go back to my main idea, we can embrace suffering through the lens of the gospel. The gospel meets us there because the gospel tells us we've all sinned, but the grace of God is greater. Paul says that God made Jesus to be sin for us who didn't do any sin so that we could be made righteous. So if you're sitting here today and you're struggling with guilt and anger over suffering that perhaps you have caused due to sin, the answer is the gospel. Now, I don't want that to sound like slapping a smiley face Band-Aid on a broken body, okay? I don't want that to sound cheesy and trite, but that is the answer. Now, that may or may not mean that all of your consequences of your sin go away today. Jeremiah is getting people to hope in the new covenant, but Jerusalem's still destroyed for over 70 more years, right? So I don't want you to mishear this, but the answer is the gospel. Forgiveness for sin is found in the gospel. Then secondly, as we wrap it up here in a minute, what about suffering that seems random? What about sickness? What about pain? What about those kind of things in the world? And again, we only learn to embrace that or understand it or process it properly through the lens of the gospel. When Jesus comes back to die, Jesus comes back, as we said before, to forgive those who place their faith in him and deal with their sin that way. But Jesus comes back to fix everything. Now, sometimes I think in evangelical churches, we do a really good job of preaching individual salvation, which is good and right and true and awesome. But we don't do such a good job with the whole reversing the curse idea, where Jesus says, I came to make everything new. Everything means everything. Jesus came to make blades of grass new. Jesus came to make clouds and mountains new. Jesus came to make you and me new, but he came to remake everything that he cursed due to sin. Jesus came once to die, to atone for that, but then he's coming back to make everything new. And again, I think the answer is gospel when we look at that kind of suffering. When we are sitting there thinking about my own sinful choices or just the stuff that seems random, I can come back and I can say, God is just, but he's good enough to have sent Jesus Christ to live, die, rise again to forgive my stupid, sinful choices that lead to suffering, but to eradicate it all from the world. And that is really, really, really good news. Paul puts it this way. I'm going to read one other paragraph from another part of the Bible, and then I'm going to give you 3 applications and we're done, okay? Paul puts it this way, over in 2 Corinthians, and I didn't tell him to put this up here, so I'll just read this one, but over in 2 Corinthians 4, Paul, who frankly suffered a lot, right? He's got that other chapter where he's like, yeah, I got beaten up this many times and shipwrecked this many times, and I was cold and I was hungry, and it's like, Paul suffered a lot. He kind of has this little session of suffering that he tells us about. But Paul says in 2 Corinthians 4:16, in the context of suffering and difficulty, Paul gives a gospel perspective, I think, to all suffering. Verse 16, Paul says this, and he's been talking about the gospel, this is why we never give up, though our bodies are dying. Now for Paul, that's the effect of aging and disease, but for Paul, that's a guy that didn't like Jesus, tied him to a post and tried to throw rocks at him until he was dead and stone him, right? So Paul's body is dying for various reasons here, right? He's suffering for both types of reasons. Paul says, though our bodies are dying, our spirits are being renewed every day. For our present troubles, or I might use the word suffering, are small and won't last very long. Now, before you get mad at Paul and you're like, Paul, my struggle is not small, Paul. Mine's going to last a long time. Before you guys get mad at Paul, he's taking an eternal perspective. Let's say that you live for 80 years on this earth and you suffer a lot. That's not good, and I want to have compassion. I don't want that to come across as heartless. But when we've been in heaven for 1,000,000,000 billion trillion years, 80 years is not that long. And I think that's sort of what Paul's doing here, right? Here's what he says then. So he says, our troubles they're temporary, they won't last long, but Paul says, yet the troubles themselves. Again, this is sort of crazy talk if you don't believe the gospel. The troubles themselves, Paul says, produce for us a glory that vastly outweighs them and will last forever. So, Paul says in verse 18, we don't look at the troubles we can see now. Rather, we fix our gaze or choose to have our perspective be on things that cannot be seen. For the things we can see now will soon be gone, but the things we cannot see will last forever. And Paul's attaching that to the gospel. So, to sew it together, 3 applications and I'm done. How can we get to the point of truly embracing suffering? I think we can only do that through the lens of the gospel. Whether that's my sinful choices that make me suffer or random suffering in the world, it's due to sin, and the gospel is the answer. So 3 applications, then I'm done. I'll pray, and then we'll transition to communion. But 3 quick applications here. First off, I think the first application here today, for you here today, is if you have not believed the gospel, that's where we start. Again, I don't know you guys and ladies. I know some of you better than others, but perhaps you've come to church a whole bunch of times. Perhaps this is the first time you've ever been in a service. Maybe you feel like you've got your life together. Maybe you feel like your life is a complete, total train wreck. Either way, we start by believing the gospel. I hope when you come to Anchor Church, you don't simply hear self-help and moralism and just try harder. That's really the difference between the gospel and other faiths. Other faiths say try hard enough to impress God. What we're saying today is you can't. You can't try hard enough. But the good news is Jesus did it for you. So believe the gospel. Come to faith. Believe the gospel. Believe that Jesus died both for your sinful choices and for your suffering, Jesus died, and for the suffering of the world. Believe the gospel. That's something, if you have more questions about that, I'd be glad to talk to you afterward. I'm sure Chris would as well. Or in a few minutes when we have communion, there'll be some people at the back, and they'd love to talk or pray with you if that's you. Number 2 then, two last applications are done. 3 total. Application number 2. Allow yourself to experience some grief and over suffering this week. Or I'll say it one more time. Allow yourself to experience grief over suffering this week. And if you're like, Dan, that's a terrible takeaway. Okay, here's what I mean by that. And I guess when I thought of this, I was thinking more about people like me. And maybe if you're really good at empathizing, maybe you just check this one off. You're like, yeah, I'm good there. But if you're like me, I want to try to make a point and make an application to you guys as well today that we actually allow ourselves either personally to have some or lament, if we can use the idea in Lamentations, over suffering this week, or if you've got a friend, child, family member, coworker, classmate, whatever it would be, allow yourself to actually experience some grief with them this week. And I'm not necessarily saying you have to go watch a sappy movie and cry it out for 3 hours. Maybe that is what you need to do. But at the very least, talk with them, pray with them. And if you're like me, and I guess I'm preaching to myself right now, don't just simply say, okay, stop it, have a stiff upper lip, here's 2 Bible verses that'll fix your problem, next person. Okay, actually take a minute to pause and process and allow yourself to experience that this week. Maybe again, this is private prayer in your own heart. Maybe this is a conversation with somebody that goes beyond that stinks, let's just fix it. Maybe it's a deeper conversation. Maybe it's praying with somebody. Maybe it's sending a note, sending an email. There's a lot of ways to do this, but really think and pray about how you can allow yourself to experience some suffering and grief this week. Number three then, last one and I'm done. Number 3, take some time this week to connect that suffering from number 2, whether that's yours or someone else's. Take some time this week to connect suffering to God's justice and the gospel. So take some time this week to connect the suffering that you thought about in number 2 to God's justice and the gospel. And here's how I'm going to suggest you do it, and I'm done with this. Figure out what that suffering is. Maybe you're sitting here today and you're like, okay, my suffering is a sickness that I have. It may seem random. I don't feel like I sinned to deserve that, but man, that's what I'm suffering with. Or maybe my friend's suffering is he made some really dumb choices and maybe he's really messed himself up financially and he's really suffering. So whatever the suffering is, get really specific. Not just my friend had a bad day, but let's get really specific. And then what I want you to do with that in mind is I want you to turn over, not necessarily right now, but this week, turn over to Romans 8 and read through that with that suffering in mind. Because Romans 8, I think, does a beautiful job of taking the, if I can put it this way, gospel hammer and smashing both kinds of suffering. Romans 8 starts out with there's no condemnation if you're in Christ Jesus. And that is good news, especially if you are the one that did something dumb. There's no condemnation. Romans goes on then to talk about how Jesus is going to come make everything new because all of creation is suffering and Jesus is going to fix it all. So whatever kind of suffering you came up with in number 2, take that in mind. Application number 3, go to Romans 8 and allow God to minister to your heart. Perhaps share that with that friend this week. Right, I'm going to